My name is Martin Poulsom. I'm a lecturer in systematic theology here at Heythrop. Although I don't like being called a systematic theologian because I think I'm a philosophical theologian. So there's a large degree of overlap between what I like and what I think is interesting and what Tony likes and Tony thought was interesting, which goes as far back as the fact that both of us did undergraduate degrees in biochemistry. Hence, I recognise the mitochondria. Today, in my paper, I'm going to do something slightly simpler than I did in the written version, which unfortunately I'd prepared slightly too late to go out to everybody, but which hopefully at least went out to all the speakers. There were 3 layers going on at the same time in that version, and I've simplified them slightly to try and only stick to 2. And those 2 related things that are going on for me today are these. One, in general, as a systematic theologian, living now and being a Roman Catholic, and the other as a participant in this conference. And I think the 2 of them overlap, at least for me, a lot. The in general thing. 50th anniversary of Vatican II and all that. What's the hermeneutic for understanding Vatican II is a big issue in the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in systematic theology right now. How do you read a text from the past so that you can be both, on the one hand, faithful to its message, whatever that was, and, on the other hand, live it out today, once you've decided what it was, in a different situation? How do you do that? Big issue for Roman Catholic theology right now, certainly since 2005, if not before. As a participant in this conference, I think the question that I've just posed is key to our conference. How do you read a text from the past so that you can both be faithful to its message and live it out today in a different situation? And I want to apply it to the Bible, because that's what the conference is about. And I also want to apply it to the writings of the theologian who I study most, Schillebeeckx. What I want to do with you today is to undertake a fairly close reading of a text first written by Schillebeeckx in 1967 in Dutch. Can that text still speak to us today, given that it was written 55 years ago in another language? Maybe. I think it can. What he's doing there is he's trying to figure out how Roman Catholics can use hermeneutics. In part because, as he recognises at the beginning of the text, the predominant use of hermeneutics up to the point where he became aware of it, at least in the mid-60s, was done mainly in Christianity in Protestant circles. And Catholics did different things. So, how can Catholics use hermeneutics? So he entitles his paper Towards a Catholic Use of Hermeneutics. And what I want to do is to introduce to you his basic idea by diving straight in to about halfway through. Because I think about halfway through is a very clear and reasonably succinct, although it's going to be the fullest slide I'm going to use, bit of text which I think we can read relatively unproblematically in English today. And it's this. I think here he is trying to talk about both how exciting and interesting hermeneutics is and how much of a challenge it is at the same time, and try and bring those 2 together. This is what he says. Hermeneutics points us to what enables us to listen to the meaning of the message which comes to us from the utterances of men in the past. Sorry that he's using the word men, but he is. That is why, on generally hermeneutical grounds, Scripture cannot be understood if the tradition of faith which has grown out of it is neglected. Biblicism is condemned in advance by the very historicity of our existence and our understanding. Simply to repeat the earlier formulae of faith word for word is to misconceive the historicity of existence, of our existence as men, and is therefore a grave danger to genuinely biblical orthodoxy. One of the key statements that I think he's making here is in that last sentence. He is opposing a merely word-for-word repetition of previous texts. In Dutch, this expression is woordelijk in the Dutch text of this paper. That word is often translated as literal or literally when it's translated into English. And in fact, in God the Future of Man, it is so translated often in the piece, I think wrongly. Seems to me that here the translator gets it right. He is opposing a word-for-word translation. I will therefore use that translation, word for word, every time Schillebeeckx uses woordelijk, if it works, because I think it does. And something interesting will come out of that later, because it means that I will only use the word literal once in this presentation. So, what difference does the hermeneutical approach to a text take? Hopefully, this is going to be fairly familiar to pretty much everybody here. This is his explanation of what he calls the hermeneutical circle. All understanding takes place in a circular movement. The answer is to some extent determined by the question, which is in turn confirmed, extended, or corrected by the answer. A new question then grows out of this understanding, so that the hermeneutical circle continues to develop in a never-ending spiral. Fairly standard account of the hermeneutical circle, the hermeneutical spiral, hopefully, as I said, familiar to many of us. So, how do you apply that to reading the Bible? This is what Schillebeeckx goes on to say. The content of the biblical text acts as a norm for our interpretation. But the text can only give an intelligible answer within the new sphere of questioning, which makes it possible to look beyond what is explicitly said in the text. The answer to this contemporary question can, however, never be the word-for-word repetition of a biblical or conciliar text. In that case, the text that we are seeking to understand would not be an answer. I think there's a couple of things worth drawing attention to here. The content of the text, he says, acts as a norm for our interpretation. And we've heard that in many of the contributions today and many of the discussions we've been having. But what kind of norm? How does it operate as a norm? He hasn't said that yet. Also, what's the content of the biblical text? And this question came up for me most strongly in the very last paper, in the discussion after Tony's paper. Well, it seems to me we might be able to say at least two things about it on the basis of this. It seems to be beyond what is explicitly said there, he seems to be saying, and it's not found in a word-for-word repetition. And those, I think, might give us clues as to where to look, at least. A little bit later on in the article, Schillebeeckx explains how it is that the content of the text lies beyond this word-for-word approach. And he defines a text. Quite handy, we might come back to this. Disagree with it violently, perhaps. A text, he says, is a document, the real meaning of which can only be understood as beyond its word-for-word meaning, because it tells us about something, a matter, which we too are trying to understand, and about which we ask questions in the light of our present-day experience. So, the content of the text, its real meaning, is somehow related to what it's on about, the matter that it's trying to talk about. And it is, I think, he's saying here, that same matter that we are striving to talk about today. It's this matter that provokes the questions that we ask, that we seek answers from the text. I'm very much helped by thinking and working in diagrams, so I'm going to share some diagrams with you now. I think if we look at this diagrammatically, the structure that Schillebeeckx is suggesting might look something like this. The real meaning, in both cases, what the text is trying to say on the one hand, what we might be trying to say on the other hand, is what connects the words that are used in the two different situations to the matter that we are speaking about. So, the matter is the same. However, the real meaning of the text and the real meaning that we are seeking might not be identical, but they are both meant to be doing the same thing, relating to the matter in the same way. And each of those real meanings is being expressed in a text in a situation. So, how do you connect the text, the meaning, and the matter to one another? This is one way of doing it. The text in a situation is connected to the matter that's being spoken about by the real meaning that the writer of the text is seeking to convey. And similarly, the words that we use in our situation are connected to the matter by the real meaning that we are seeking to express. Note that for Schillebeeckx, we can't get at the matter directly. So in a sense, this diagram is a little inaccurate. So I'm correcting it by saying that. In part because he's not offering a transcendental analysis. You don't transcend the text and situation to get to the meaning, and then transcend the meaning to get to the matter. He's not offering that kind of analysis, because he's not a transcendental thinker. Because he thinks, to do that, if we could get at the matter directly, we would only be able to do it if somehow there was some timeless and spaceless bit of us that could get at the matter directly. Because the matter doesn't change, he doesn't think. As Schillebeeckx puts it himself, man can never escape from this circle, the hermeneutical circle, because he can never establish once and for all the truth or the content of the Word of God. There is no definitive, timeless understanding which raises no more questions. So, in this structure, the text operates as a norm for our understanding via its real meaning, the matter that it's speaking about, and then into the interaction between the meaning that we are seeking to express and the text that we write as a result. Note how the link is being made between the text that we are translating and the text that we are writing. It's a 4-step process that's involved here, he says. So, it is neither of the two following ones. It's not that. It's not the case, for Schillebeeckx, that there is a direct correlation between the words that the text uses on the one hand and the words that we ought to use on the other hand. After all, that would be to approach the task of translation in a word-for-word way, which he's been consistently, at least on my reading of his text, opposing as inadequate, and doing so on hermeneutical grounds. That's why you can't take a word-for-word approach. What's also not happening, I think, in his view, is this. Here, there is a direct correlation between the real meaning of the text, once we've established what that is, and the words that we ought to use in our situation now. And he opposes this because he's concerned that what this view does is it treats the real meaning of the text as if it's timeless and spaceless. In other words, it conflates the distinction between the real meaning of the source text and the matter that the text is trying to speak about. If you view things this way, he thinks, then you could draw a direct link between an unchanging meaning of a text and how we might express that meaning today. I think there are some systematic theologians who give the impression that this is what should happen in translation, and I think Schillebeeckx is arguing with them here. What this generates, he thinks, is a correlation, and I'm using that word deliberately because it's a term of friendship and abuse in the systematic theology world. It's a correlation between an unchanging tradition and a changing situation. People who are inclined to look at it this way say you can see that correlation in the original text. You've got the real meaning, the traditional meaning, which is expressed in a particular way in the source text. And what we seek to do today is to express that same meaning in our time and place, a correlation of tradition and situation. But, Schillebeeckx argues, this is to simplify the situation too much. Because, he says, tradition isn't, in fact, static. If it were, then, and the example he uses is what Trent meant when it talked about the Eucharist will be blatantly obvious to us. And it's not. Look at all of the different interpretations of what the Eucharistic understanding of Trent was. That in itself shows us that whatever the real meaning of Trent was, it's not obvious and possibly not even univocal. I think it's easy to make exactly the same observation about the Bible. We wouldn't need so many commentaries on 1 Corinthians if it was obvious what Paul meant. Or indeed Vatican II, for me, as a contemporary systematic theologian. In that case, how should you approach a past text with your question in order to get from it the answer that both respects the text and respects your question? Because if you can't get at the matter directly, you actually can't do the earlier one, even if neither of the alternatives work, or are undesirable at least. Now, not surprisingly, Schillebeeckx says this involves a serious tension. It's not easy. Now we get on to the not easy part of hermeneutics and translation. Anyone wishing to understand a Tridentine canon or a New Testament text, he says, for example, has to transfer himself into the past. In his enquiry, he must take as his central point of reference people who are different from his contemporaries and strange to him, and a past period, making the perspective within which the earlier writer formed his view his own. This is not a simple text. And what I am going to suggest to you is what I think is going on here. And you might not all agree. I think Schillebeeckx is articulating 2 principles here. And it's not easy to spot the first one, because he talks about the second one at length. The inquirer, the first one, must transfer themselves into the past. In other words, they must not be tempted to abstract away from or somehow bracket out their situation and context in the encounter. They must transfer themselves. That's the first principle. The second principle is the one that he spends more time talking about because it might be more difficult to express. At the same time as doing that, they must take, interestingly, he says, as their central point of reference, people who are different from them. Notice he doesn't say a text here. After all, the author of the text and the words of the text are intertwined in this kind of approach. It's the person or people who both write and hear the text that the contemporary inquirer is in dialogue with. The second principle is the main one of the two. That's why I think he's calling it central. This confirms and at the same time also sheds a little more light on, I think, what he said earlier when on the previous slide we saw the content of the biblical text acts as a norm for our interpretation. I think this sheds a little more light on what he means by that. The content of the biblical text isn't the only norm, because he's just expressed another one. We've got to transfer ourselves. But it is the main norm. It's the most important one. The challenge, and it's a significant one, and I think in the intervening 55, 56 years, it's become possibly an incredibly contentious statement to make, is to try to see things from the author's point of view. And there are those, not only in theology but also in philosophy, who would now contend that that is impossible. Schillebeeckx, however, thinks it is possible, and in fact thinks it's an essential element of translation, to try to see things from the point of view of the people that you're in dialogue with, the author and their context. And at the same time, keep hold of your own perspective as well. And put those 2 points of view, those 2 perspectives into dialogue with each other. I think that's what he's proposing here. Again, I'd like to represent this diagrammatically. And I think it's possible to draw now the diagram that I had earlier without having to use the matter as the bridge. So what I'd like to suggest is that what I'm about to show you is what I think he's proposing, in fact. So here's the dialogue between, on the one hand, real meaning of the text and the words that the text uses in its situation, in its context, and the real meaning that we are seeking and the words that we use in our situation. And we're already aware that you don't draw a direct link either between the words and the words, or between the real meaning of a text and the words that we use in our situation, because he thinks both of those make a mistake. So, what's left? Well, it seems to me that rather than connecting the words used by the text or its real meaning directly to the words that we might use today, what Schillebeeckx is proposing is to connect the interrelation between text and meaning now and text and meaning then. Because he thinks that text and meaning are fundamentally interrelated. You can't get at one without getting at the other. So the best way to set up the dialogue is by interrelating that interrelation between text and meaning then and text and meaning now, which might be represented like that. Later in his theological career, in his retirement speech in Nijmegen in 1983, so he wrote this in 1967, Schillebeeckx revisited this topic. He even called his retirement speech by the same title, The Understanding of Faith in the Year 1983. And The Understanding of Faith was the title of the book in which this 1967 article came out. So he's deliberately, I think, revisiting this topic. He calls the structure that he's proposing, and he draws a diagram incredibly like this in 1983. And he calls this structure one which involves a proportional norm rather than a direct norm. So he's getting to the point where he's able to describe how he thinks the text acts as a norm for our understanding, for our translation of it. Commenting on the significance of this approach for theology, and particularly for theology within Roman Catholic circles, Eric Borgman, just about a year ago, said this: "The message contemporary people embody by following Jesus should relate to their situation in the same way as Jesus' message and actions were related to his situation. Loyalty to Jesus' message is not preaching the same substantial message, but participating and intervening in the contemporary context in the same way as Jesus participated and intervened in his context. This is a rather revolutionary idea because it introduces the current socio-cultural context into the very core of Revelation itself. And I think Borgman's right about that. Now, as if that weren't enough of a conclusion to draw, I'd like to mention two more that are found in the 1967 text. Borgman here is commenting on the 83 text. First is about biblical studies, specifically about eisegesis and exegesis, and he does conclude about that. Because, he says, hermeneutics changes and enriches and helpfully clarifies how to understand eisegesis, what's wrong with it, and how to avoid it. Because, he says, everyone who studies biblical texts, and I hope you're all going to go, oh, yes, 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 we do. Everyone who studies biblical texts, he argues, agrees that simply reading your own contemporary situation into the text is wrong. Please nod. He says, because everyone who studies biblical text agrees that it's really important to remain open to the text, which acts as a norm for our understanding of it. So he goes back to that norm language again. However, he says, what is thematically new in modern hermeneutics, in other words, up to 1967, is our having come to realise that this openness is made possible not by our adopting a neutral attitude and putting our own background in brackets in an effort to exclude it, but only by doing the direct opposite. We should remain conscious of the fact that we must approach the text from a pre-understanding, and that we must, in so doing, confront the text with our own pre-understanding. The process of understanding is accomplished precisely in the possible correction of our pre-understanding. This is precisely the account of the hermeneutical circle of question and answer with which he began on page 7, the very first slide, well, second slide, in fact, that I showed you. So hermeneutics helps us to understand what eisegesis is, what mistake it makes, and how to try and avoid it. What hermeneutics also shows us, says Schillebeeckx, is that exegesis on its own is not enough. He says, our understanding of a traditional text takes place only in its application to the present, and not in a kind of interpretation in itself, in a historical reconstruction or in a return to the original period. Christian understanding of the Bible is therefore different from what is known simply as exegesis. If an earlier truth is to be preserved in accordance with its original intention, it must be reformulated in the light of the present and interpreted differently. Understanding must change in changing situations. Otherwise, the same thing cannot continue to be understood. This, I think, articulates the hermeneutic of continuity and change in a way which is quite sophisticated and very challenging, I think. I don't think it's impossible, though. It might be that I'm somewhat charitably inclined towards Schillebeeckx, but I would argue that he had a go at doing this himself. And he wrote 2 enormous books in which he tried to do it, one called Jesus and one called Christ. I think his Christology, that he wrote almost as soon as he'd finished writing this stuff about hermeneutics, was an attempt to do what he was saying. Not easy, but I think possible. The second conclusion that he draws in the 1967 text is also one that informs his Christological project, I think, and seems to me to be a very challenging one indeed for for a conference on translation. It has to do with what he calls the biblical primacy of the future. You might say, perhaps the eschatological. It is possible to express our understanding of the Bible in this way, he says. We should not look back at the Bible, but rather look forward with the Bible to a future which is given to us to be achieved. To be achieved, but also given us to be achieved. I think there are two things happening here. I think Schillebeeckx is saying that the future that the Bible points us towards is given by God. So it's important to note that we can't just interpret the Bible however we like if we want to try to remain faithful to what's given, to, if you like, the divine voice which is speaking through this text. However we try and understand what that means and how it directs our translation. At the same time, though, what is given to us. The gift really is given. So in a real sense, it's now up to us. As a result, he says, a purely theoretical hermeneutics isn't enough. What biblical interpretation points to in the end, and he's taking this from Bultmann and disagreeing with him, must be orthodoxy as the basis of the orthopraxis whereby the promise realises a new future in us. It is only in the sphere of action, of doing in the faith, that orthodox interpretation can be inwardly fulfilled, with the result that interpretation becomes hermeneutics of praxis. This, I think, ties the past, the present, and the future together hermeneutically, in a praxis that I think can legitimately be called the praxis of the reign of God, a theme which is present in a great deal of work on Schillebeeckx. This is the 1967 version of the priority of praxis in Schillebeeckx. It is not interpretation that has the last word, but orthopraxis, making everything new by virtue of God's promise. It is a question of being orientated towards the grace of the future, remembering God's promise and being active in faith, and in so doing, making dogma true. I think the three verbs that Schillebeeckx uses in that last sentence convey attitudes that he is recommending towards the past, the present, and the future in a hermeneutical spirit. The past, he is saying, is approached in an attitude of remembering, possibly of memorial, in the hermeneutical manner that he's just outlined. The present is a time not only of being reflective, contemplative, perhaps even, he was a Dominican after all, and theoretically astute, yes, all of those, and also, and interestingly primarily for him, being active. Thirdly, as the translator remains open to the future, what they are called to do is to realise the meaning of Scripture, or indeed of dogma, in both the meanings that we tend to use in English of that term, I think. This implies theoretically realising what the interaction with the text involves, what it means for our understanding, and how the translator might express that today. It also involves, and must involve, for Schillebeeckx, if it is to respond to the hermeneutical challenge fully, making what the text means a reality, as they make a better future. A future promised by God in the biblical text, a future in which the translator will meet the God of the promise, a God who, to their surprise, will always be unexpectedly new. Thank you. Okay, go.
Yeah, I have two things. First, very brief. You said in the morning today that you'd like me to comment on your translation of word by word of Woordelijk. Can do. Would you like that? Yeah. Okay. I agree with you with your translation of word by word rather than literally, because Woordelijk does mean that, and we have a different Dutch translation of the word literally, which is letterlijk. And sounds very much the same, so you can tell that that is the case. And whereby literally, like the letterlijk, like the English literally, is the opposite of metaphorically. So you can translate a text literally, in which case as soon as you encounter a metaphor, and you recognize it as such, you don't actually choose a new metaphor. You translate to pull somebody's leg as pulling legs and things, which loses the metaphorical meaning. So that's a literal translation, whereas word-by-word translation is a bit more flexible, whereby you can translate some phrases and preserve the metaphorical meaning. You can have that in a woordelijk translation. I completely think that it's a good thing to point out that literal translation, literally is not a good translation. It might sometimes work, but it's not always a good translation of woordelijk. Second point is, it's a very interesting theory. However, I wonder if it is very specific to a specific context, the theory of Schillebeeckx on translation of a text. Your four-part drawing of how these steps go. I think what we take to be a meaning or the matter, what a Bible is or a text is about. Yeah. I think, and the hermeneutical questions that people might seek, what sort of meaning they might seek in the text, the answers to the questions they might seek, I think are largely dependent on what sort of group is doing the translation. And I think that has not only to do with the distances in time and space, but I think the we and us that is throughout your talk, our interpretation, and we do this and we translate and so on. I read it in this talk as we Christians, or we Catholics, or we, I don't know. I think a translation there's still a hermeneutics going on if, for instance, a non-Christian translates the Bible.
Yes.
However, I wondered if then the same graph still applies. If you come into a text hermeneutically, you always, of course, come in hermeneutically within some hermeneutics. If you come in as in, I do not expect this text to answer these and these questions for me. What I want to find in this text, what sort of questions it answers for them, for those people, not for me, but for those people, the original addressees. Would then the same structure apply?
I think yes and no, for two reasons. One is that fairly early on in the article, Schillebeeckx says he doesn't think that the Bible is a special case. So he says, as far as I'm concerned, the kinds of hermeneutical issues that are being brought up in hermeneutics, in philosophy, in language studies, are applicable to Christianity. So they're applicable to understanding a previous Christian author, like Augustine. They're applicable to understanding a definitive text, like a council document, which is authoritative within the church in which that document's put together. And they're also applicable to the Bible. It's not as if you've got different sets of criteria that you ought to use in different test cases. Okay, so in that sense, the answer is yes. Okay. However, I think the answer is also no in part because what he's also very honest about is that he's writing something that is saying, okay, how might we learn from this as Roman Catholic Christians? So he's saying, well, this is an attempt to move towards a Catholic use of hermeneutics. So how can we use all this and learn from it and apply it to the issues that we're really bothered about, which include how do you understand the Council of Trent? How do you understand 1 Corinthians? What do you do with them? How do you translate them into language that people might be able to relate to today? And he'd already done a bit of that in his work on the Eucharist, in which he'd argued for a change in Eucharistic terminology from the terminology of Trent, partly on the same kind of grounds that Barth and Rana say, stop using the word person when you use Trinity, because it doesn't mean that anymore. And he was saying, transubstantiation doesn't mean that anymore. So you can't use it to try and express what they were trying to express by using that terminology. So to some extent, there is transferability, I think. But I think at the same time, what you're trying to do with it within a particular linguistic community, faith community, however you want to talk about that, means that your use of the hermeneutical issues will be distinctive within that. So, for example, to take the diagram with the matter in it, given that what Schillebeeckx is really interested in are conciliar documents and the Bible, then it would actually be quite difficult to set up a dialogue if the contemporary interpreter weren't a Christian for him, because the matter's unimportant. What does it, what significance does it have? Well, very little. So in a way he's saying, well, we can learn from the hermeneutical enquiries that are going on outside of the Roman Catholic Church, outside of Christianity, outside of theology, all of that. And the way in which we do it will be slightly different, partly because we tend to think there is a matter. Now, he's being a realist about that. Yeah, and partly because he's a realist. An anti-realist would say the first graph is impossible, even if the second isn't. So the second diagram that I drew might possibly work with an anti-realist understanding, maybe, because there's no matter in that one. But Schillebeeckx thinks that both of them apply, in part because he thinks, as a realist Roman Catholic Christian, that there is a matter, partly because he thinks that the Bible is inspired by God, partly because he thinks that church councils are guided by the Holy Spirit in some way. Not inspired, like the Bible, but somehow guided. So he thinks that there is this dimension, this transcendent, timeless, spaceless dimension, if you like, which is captured by the matter, which simply wouldn't be there if somebody wasn't a believer or somebody was anti-realist about God. So I think both and is the answer I would want to give, not surprisingly, as a Roman Catholic.
Thank you, Ron. I'm thinking two things at once. One is how similar some of the arguments out of Bultmann's article is exegesis without presuppositions possible. Written at not a very different time, and how those two can come into conversation with each other fruitfully.
Yes, and he's partly arguing with Bultmann.
Yeah, but in a fruitful argument.
Yes.
So, the people who don't live within this community, there's another way into that, I think.
Yes.
And the other is I was wondering about Stanley Fish's interpreter communities as again a way of just, I don't mean breaking out of this because this is internally consistent and satisfying, I think, but saying that's another way of establishing a community of understanding of texts based on, is there a text in this class?
Yes.
Which is one of the more useful things for a biblical scholar to remember.
Yes.
So there's those two small.
Yes. I mean, one of the points he makes part way through, and it was in one of the sections that I was looking at, is that he's inclined to think that Bultmann has overdone the distinction between the words that are used in the text in a situation and the real meaning of the text. He thinks he's over-separated them, such that he's worried. I don't think he's accusing Bultmann of doing this, but he's worried that that line of thinking might over-separate them to the extent that the real meaning can float free and become timeless and spaceless, and that the Bultmann reading might lead to the second mistake version that I was outlining. So what he's wanting to say is, well, as long as you realise that the text in its situation and what the author is trying to say and what the readers are trying to understand in the text are so intertwined that you can't separate them, then you can use that analysis. But you have to be conscious all the time that they are totally intertwined and you can't separate them.
It's a while since I really thought about the language of eisegesis and exegesis. Because that's what we were talking about
Yes.
30 years ago.
Yes.
And I think there's a sort of historical interest about an article that was written in the first instance in 1967
Yes.
and rewritten in 1983.
Yes.
That gives me some sense of how that language has been overtaken in some.
And one of the things I'm quite looking forward to as an English-speaking Schillebeeckx scholar is I hope very much, and I'm assured that it is going to happen, that the 1983 text will be translated into English soon. Because there is actually a project underway to retranslate most of Schillebeeckx's main texts into English a second time. Partly because, and this touches on something that was in Tony's paper, partly because the community of Schillebeeckx scholars that speak both Dutch and English, and I count myself as a very minor member of that group because I don't speak Dutch fluently, to use Tony's criteria. I don't do that at all. But they are more or less of a mind, and have been for at least 30 years, that Schillebeeckx's texts were not translated well first time round. Not because they weren't translated by people who were fluent in both English and Dutch, they were, but that another criterion for good translation wasn't present, that the translators were not fluent in Schillebeeckx's theology. And as a result, they produced perfectly serviceable and workable English translations, but what they didn't quite manage to capture was the theological nuance and what he was trying to say, if you like, the music that was in the French philosophy that Tony was talking about. And there is that also in Schillebeeckx's Flemishized Dutch, because although he lived most of his life in Holland, there are many Dutch speakers who said he never actually left Flanders behind linguistically. And there's a slight complexity there too. So hopefully, when that set of translations starts coming out, possibly next year, I will be able to revisit them and do a bit of comparison with, a bit like Nick's text, with the Dutch, the 1967 translation and the 2000 and whenever translation side by side, and say, okay, which one of these is better and why? In the meantime, I am forced to try and offer my own and say, I think this is what's going on here. I think this is the best way to render it in English, and this is why. Because if you render it in English this way, then you capture this nuance, and I think this nuance is important in what he's arguing.
I suppose you're reaffirming this statement that's been made a few times, whereby translation is an art, and you're saying it isn't just an art, it's a hermeneutical art.
Yes.
An interpretive art, where you need to step into the world of somebody's discourse and try to understand why they wrote and why you're reading it.
Yes. Yes. And it seems to me that Schillebeeckx's insistence that you shouldn't bracket out your own situation to do that well, that hermeneutical sensitivity, there's no such thing as an impartial observer. There's no such thing as a neutral position. There's no such thing as trying to figure out what Paul really meant without you being involved is impossible. And you shouldn't even try it. It's undesirable.
So the positivism of the 19th century made us all march like this, and then about 1983 people were we can't be impartial and we can't be objective. But it's quite hopeful when he says we are subjective, we are partial,
Yes.
but that's how we go about it.
Yes.
That's how we must go about it.
Yes. And that In a sense that the art, the trick that he's trying to suggest is to allow yourself to be very conscious of both of those contexts and situations at the same time, such that they do literally, rub up against one another. Because otherwise, if you don't take your own situation in, then the question's not your question. It might be someone else's question, but it's not yours. And if you don't allow the text to answer your question, if you don't allow its context to be part of that dialogue, then the text isn't answering the question. A reconstruction is answering your question. And you need to try and avoid both of those mistakes if you can.
I think for me the really important thing that comes from your paper too is it strikes me biblical studies is a bad case, because most biblical studies people I know many languages. I've had incredible experience of all these issues. The problem seems to come in subject domains, for example, like my own philosophy, where there's sometimes, and more than sometimes, the presumption that actually translation is not a problem.
Yeah.
In other words, people doing an undergraduate degree in philosophy will know no other language than English and think that's not really a problem. Whereas in the context of biblical studies, it'd be unthinkable, I think, for people who didn't know at least the Greek and the Hebrew and so on. And it seems to me that's what your paper brings up to me, that there's a sort of, in this sort of school of translation, we're beginning to learn, if we really want to try and make some progress, some of the conditions need to be in place to allow that to happen. And one of them is a better understanding of what's going on in translation. And biblical studies seems to be to something like philosophy, say, how many undergraduates have a clue about the French of Descartes? We presumably understand what Descartes does. And that's not only at the student level.
Yes.
Like to add to that, the stuff you said about, or the Schillebeeckx said about getting into the past, I think there is a role that for some decades now we've been kind of looking for in biblical studies, for the good old and sometimes too readily disparaged historical critical method.
Yes.
So that functions precisely to get us back into the past. So I just want to support that.
Although occasionally I've been touched by how hopeful people are about our historical abilities. Tony has talked about time travel, and I thought if only. Although I rather suspect if I could get in a time machine and go back to 1st century Galilee and met Jesus, I wouldn't understand what he was talking about. And he would understand me even if I knew Aramaic. I don't know.
Yes.
But,
Yes. I mean, and the reverse version of that is my somewhat flippant response to the question, what would Jesus do? Which is, be very confused.
we might scratch our heads at each other.
Yeah.
But I ended up adding what might have looked like a rather disjointed, free-floating section at the beginning of what I wrote about what I think history is, because I started with the sense that history is not the study of the past, because I really don't think it is the study of the past. It's only the study of the past in as much as the present passes. And so it's rather incidental that it's the study of the past. But any text, once it's been written, its origin recedes into the past part. What history is, I think, is the rather knotty question of how do I use documents produced by communities to try to understand their contexts, both the context of the document and the context of the community. So I may end up with increasingly sensitive things to say about that time and place, which is like the time travel we aspire to. But I keep bumping up against the limits of the method and the evidence, and saying a lot of this remains hypothetical. And much of my study involves what may I not say, can this text tell me or can it not? And I can't pretend to stand up in front of undergraduates and say, I know all about how Roman people thought. Write it down, I've got 10 points.
Although some would say that might not be so bad at undergraduate level. You know, I mean, at undergraduate level, I tell the story of 20th century systematic theology as an endless to and fro between dialectical and correlational methodology. I actually think that analysis is woeful. But at undergraduate level, at least at first year undergraduate level, it's not bad. It gets you in, and hopefully, my hope is that the astute and good student will get to their third year and say, Martin, you know that thing you told us in first year, it doesn't work, does it?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, no, it doesn't.
Which is why you're asking that question now.
Exactly. Yeah. But, you know, there are inadequate ways in, which nevertheless might serve as being ways in. But if our analysis remains at that inadequate level, then we're not going to get much further than just in. And my impression is that one of the things that we're tussling with over these 2 days is how do we get past a basic understanding that will get us further than first base, to use that metaphor.